This is Tom Fox. Welcome to a special 5-part podcast series on the fight to secure supply chains through cross-industry innovation. This podcast series is sponsored by Exiger. In this series, we will explore the ongoing efforts of Exiger to lead the discussion and enhancement of supply chain risk management. First, a word about Exiger's Supply Chain Explorer. Today, risk management professionals and procurement professionals are swamped. A new artificial intelligence risk detection tool is helping Fortune 500 companies and government agencies surface, understand, and mitigate critical threats to their third-party and supplier networks literally within hours. Introducing Supply Chain Explorer, a groundbreaking AI platform developed by Exiger, a leading global risk and compliance SaaS company. Exiger Supply Chain Explorer is a next-generation platform built on award-winning AI that delivers instantaneous transparency, allowing you to meet the urgent imperative to protect global supply chains from sanctions, ESG, and cyber risk at unprecedented speed and scale. With single-click supply chain detection, high-level due diligence, and risk analysis, everyone can now join the fight to secure our global supply chains. For the first time, you can even spot potential disruptions before they impact your supply chain. Check out Exiger's Supply Chain Explorer. In this episode 2, I'm joined by Nick Wildgoose and Kim Lee to take a look at supply chain issues in the manufacturing and consumer market sectors. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox back for another episode. Today I have with me Nick Wildgoose and Kim Lee. And before we get started, first of all, welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today. I was wondering if you could tell us what your current roles are, and Kim, could we start with you?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom, for having me. I'm from Exiger, an Associate Managing Director here based out of the Sydney office.
Hi, Tom. Yeah, nice to be with you today. I have the title of Consultant within Exiger, and my specialist area is supply chain risk.
And today we're going to visit about manufacturing and consumer issues. So I wanted to start with maybe Kim with you. What are some of the key challenges you see in supply chain risk management in the manufacturing and consumer sectors?
Thanks, Tom. So as a sector, I think manufacturing consumer sector is quite diverse. We're really talking about a broad range of items, right from sort of electronics, automotives, clothing, and food, which are all really quite vastly different. But a common denominator across all of them is the acute need to be cost efficient. Whilst I think cost efficiency is relevant to all supply chain, it is absolutely critical to manufacturing consumer sectors. Any marginal savings or cost excess can really make the difference between a profit or a loss. I think with this imperative for cost efficiency, it's now sort of become, it's been very well entrenched practices across manufacturing consumer sectors, just-in-time manufacturing where they're holding limited safety stock. We have centralised single distribution centres where everything is dispatched from a centralised hub. And concentration of countries for sourcing or manufacturing, as those countries are seen to be able to provide the best price or the quickest turnaround. I think in the last few years, what we have seen in the manufacturing and consumer sector supply chain is that it's been challenged like never before. In particular, these well-accepted practices have really been put to test. I want to talk to sort of two factors, both from a macroeconomic perspective and two from a more of an other factors which are not new but is increasingly challenging. In terms of a macroeconomic factors perspective, COVID restrictions have really disrupted every part of our supply chain. This includes sort of air freight, ocean freight, land freight, all disrupted, resulting in shortage of supply. And then we've also seen, as a result of COVID, factory shutdowns and labour shortages, which again has impacted supply. These factors have really struck at the heart of, just-in-time manufacturing, where the flow of goods and supplies are no longer reliable. The other sort of macroeconomic factor is really geopolitical. We're talking here, we're seeing currently the Ukraine-Russia crisis. We've got the China-US trade wars, which have been going for a little while. And in Australia, where I currently live, we've seen sort of growing tensions with Australia and China, which has disrupted and resulted in shortages of supply chain to different degrees. And this, again, is sort of striking at the heart of then that very entrenched policy of, centralising distribution practices, or the fact that, we're sort of gravitating to certain countries for sourcing or manufacturing. On top of these sort of very sort of substantive macroeconomic issues, we've witnessed other factors, which is definitely, again, increasing challenges for manufacturing consumer sectors. Two factors which I really want to concentrate on is the increasing regulatory pressures. In the UK and Australia, we've had Modern Slavery Act statements, which has really put onus on corporations to share how they're managing their modern slavery within their organisations and their supply chains. In the US, in December, a bill was passed barring products made with forced labour. Whilst this has always been banned in terms of importing goods with slave or forced labour, the bill has really just really changed the burden to corporations to really prove that their factories are free of slavery and coercion. And very, very recently, Germany itself has adopted the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which will set binding standards for large corporations and their value chains to identify, assess, prevent, and remedy human rights. So these are all, really big legislations, and we're seeing more and more coming through, putting increasing onuses and regulatory pressures on organisations to really make sure their supply chain is clean and free of forced labour. The other factor we're seeing is the increasing consumer expectations. So now, more than ever, consumers are much more informed. They're able to very readily understand the supply chains of organisations, and I think they're now expecting more. So in the March 2022 EY Future Consumer Index, has highlighted that consumers are choosing to make sustainable purchases, doing what they can to preserve the environment, with 56% saying that they will pay more attention to environmental impacts of their purchases, and 52% committing to more attention to social impacts. So I think all of these factors, both the macroeconomic and the two factors I mentioned around regulatory pressures and the sustainable and consumer expectations, is really challenging the status quo and putting a lot of onus around supply chain risk and making sure that organisations are managing those risks, which really I think is a really exciting time to be a supply chain risk practitioner, but at the same time it can be overwhelming.
Nick, if perhaps I could set up the question for you in the following manner. Kim's laid out for us some operational risk, regulatory risks, and now consumer, perhaps social pressure risks. If I could overlay that for you with the impacts of COVID and recent geopolitical events, how have you seen manufacturing consumer sectors cope with these increased pressures and indeed even increasing risks?
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for that. Yeah, well, the good news, I suppose, is they have managed to keep a lot of the supply chains going despite these challenges. I'd call them like the supply chain heroes, that they're actually keeping these supply chains moving along. But it has been at significant costs, and we're aware that in a number of cases there have been shortages and still are shortages, such as around semiconductors. Still causes problem for many industries. And I think when I talk about that significant cost, it's worth talking about the Deloitte's supply chain research in 2021, looking at third-party risk. And to put that cost into context, 20% of their respondents indicated they'd suffered over $500 million of impact in 2021. So over $500 million of impact in that year. So as I say, it's significant costs, and that really bears out as well, Tom, how COVID and these geopolitical events are impacting on supply chains. And in that respect, just picking out another survey, McKinsey in 2020 said that on average, across industry sectors, including manufacturing and consumer, that they thought over a 10-year period based on the existing risk back in 2020, and I believe the risk picture is getting worse, that there would be an impact in that 10-year period of around 45% of 1 year's EBITDA, which you and I know is a considerable sum of impact on the costs of business performance. And I think the other observation I'd say, where companies have really struggled from a COVID point of view, and it really continues a trend, by the way, and that's in their understanding of multi-tier supply chains and the impact that that can have on them. So I've been involved with research in that area since 2010 with the Business Continuity Institute, and around 40% we discovered of disruptions, and it's been pretty steady at that figure over these last 12 years now, come from below the tier 1 suppliers. And out of COVID, in talking to lots of corporates, that's where they still face the challenge, is looking at below the tier 1. And just to pick out one specific incident of how much of an impact this can have, if I just illustrate it, it's an event that goes back to 2012. We've seen similar incidents in COVID, of course, but this was where there was an explosion at a chemical plant of a company called Evonik, just one part of the plant in Marl in Germany, and it caused a shortage of a resin, and this resin, it's PA12, is actually used in brake manufacture, and the automotive sector realized that that was around about 25% of the world's capacity. So they had to quickly obviously resource other sources of material, make use of inventory and so on. Again, a significant cost, and again just showing how connected and dependent these supply chains are, even on just one part of a location around the global network. So multi-tier understanding is critical. And I think the other things that have come out of COVID is, how do you segment your suppliers, building on what Kim said earlier in terms of ESG and so on. And just picking out a COVID example here, there's not many procurement teams, and I used to head them up, that thought about protective equipment as being a strategic commodity prior to COVID. So you would give it typically to your junior buyer to source at the most, this is before COVID, at the lowest cost. Suddenly COVID comes along and you can't operate your manufacturing lines or your consumer sector stores without PPE, and suddenly it's become strategic. So you need to also reassess your risk management aspects. And I think the other thing that companies have realized, and it comes out of our Stacks report study as well, is that they do need technology and data to look at this better, to bring together the silos across the organization and link up better their approaches. So Tom, hopefully that's kind of answered your question there.
So Kim, we've laid out several problems or issues in the manufacturing and consumer sector around supply chain risk. How do you see those sectors working to improve their approach around risk management?
Thanks, Tom. That's a great question. I think there's two facets to how I want to approach that question. First relates a lot to, it's a really good time now for organisations to revisit their supply chain risk management framework and ensure that it is fit for purpose, well communicated and understood. So in the current environment, we're expecting continued disruptions, whether it is the continuing after effects of COVID, the unstable geopolitical environment, the increasing sort of expectations on consumers, the increasing regulatory expectations. We're expecting all of those to continue to be challenging factors for manufacturing consumer sectors. Nick talked to the importance of understanding multi-tiers of your organizations, of your supply chain, apologies. So the question is, does your organization understand that? Do they have a formal framework on, how far down the supply chain they're going to look into? What are the risks that are most important to them from a supply chain perspective? Like any other risk areas, a fundamental requirement for an organisation is to have a clear framework which sets out what the organisation is seeking to achieve. This includes, what is the company's risk appetite? Are there certain suppliers which you do not want to engage with? What are the risk tolerances? Are there, certain countries where, particular high corruption based countries where you want to take more scrutiny around the suppliers you engage with from those areas? And also, as I mentioned earlier, is what are the key risk areas which are critical to your suppliers? Is it modern slavery? Is it resilience? Are you, or is it operational efficiency, which takes priority over all of those? This framework is important to ensure that everyone in the organisation understands where the company stands and also how to approach supply chain risk management program in a consistent and coherent manner. No supply chain or procurement function is fully centralised. There's always going to be a team of people across the organisations who are helping manage supply chain risk, and therefore this coordinated approach under the framework is important to a successful risk management plan. A great resource I do want to draw attention to our listeners is the Exiger's Trades Framework, which is available on our website. The heart of the framework is to allow organisations to achieve supply chain resilience and optimise their supply chain risk management across a range of different maturities. If organisations are still looking for assistance, we have a team of really experienced professionals who have actually worked in supply chain risk management teams in large organisations who can also bring that expertise and pragmatic advice to how to shape your supply chain risk management program and framework. The second facet I really want to talk to is also sort of relates very neatly to Nick's other point around technology. The effective use of technology is fundamental to the success of the supply risk management program. A typical large organisations have thousands of suppliers. To really be able to understand, is there any negative media? Are they sanctioned? Are there associate sanctions? Is there any presence? Do they have any presence in high-risk jurisdictions? All of that is really difficult to do manually. Technology is what's going to be able to enable you to really quickly understand where the risk is across your supplier base, and then obviously helps you prioritise where to focus your areas. And to Nick's point around sort of, multi-tiers, so once you've got 1,000 suppliers, once you go deeper into it, the numbers of suppliers that you need to be looking at will just exponentially increase really quickly. So again, it really stresses the importance of having and be able to, really appreciate and use technology within and understand, to use technology to understand the supply risk profiles of your supplier base. Now, our research have highlighted that 33% of large organisations are spending over $2 million, and 100% of organisations expect the level of spend to increase in the next 3 years. And I know one of the biggest challenges for all organisations that we speak to on a day-to-day basis with our clients is understanding the second and deeper tiers of the supply chain. And I think to that point, Exiger has developed a really great solution, which is the Supplier Chain Explorer, which really helps organisations to very quickly understand where their key dependencies are, what is the risk profile of their suppliers deeper down their supply chain. And again, all of this will help organisations to prioritise where to focus their attention and also where they need to put more resources on to better understand where their risks are within their supply chain.
So, Nick, if I could perhaps take the same question that I posed to Kim, but ask you to turn your head maybe down the road to the future. One of the things that I've certainly learned, and I think most in this space have learned over the past years during COVID, is the overall importance of supply chain risk management. And how do you see this playing out in 2025 or perhaps even further down the road?
Yeah, well, we first recognise, as Thomas, we already talked about in this podcast, there's a lot of supply chain risks that can still continue to impact on teams at the moment currently. But I think there's a kind of elephant in the room as well, and that is around climate risk, particularly from a supply chain point of view in the consumer and manufacturing sectors, although it applies to nearly all of them, and that is the fact that somewhere between 80 to 90% quite often of the carbon footprint of an organization is in its supply chain. And therefore, unless you understand your multi-tier exposure, how are the CEOs standing up to say they're going to, achieve a net zero? And we know that the financial community, through initiatives like the climate financial disclosure, are looking at more disclosures around the impact of climate risk on companies. And indeed, the investment community, such as people like Larry Fink at BlackRock, have said that sustainability is kind of a competitive, material issue that needs to be addressed, and something he is looking at with his 7 trillion, that was probably a year ago, there might even be more, of assets under management. So investors increasingly are looking at this, Tom, as something they care about. And as Kim brought up in one of her earlier points, the consumers also are expecting companies to be more sustainable and to assess their climate risk. And as I say, that comes back to the multi-tier, which is where our Supply Chain Explorer product can come in by helping you in what is not an easy task, but to start to prioritize where you need to put your risk management efforts in looking at this climate risk. And unfortunately, Tom, we only have one planet to live on, so we have got to kind of change our approach and deal with net zero quickly, and that needs the right kind of technology and digital assets, I think data, to do that. So that would be the key risk I see coming down the track. Perhaps just mentioning one other briefly is understanding your cyber risk, because we're aware, and I think you may have featured in earlier podcasts, things like the SolarWinds issue, or Target is now quite an old issue, but the challenges there to the supply chain came through the digital route. It was a supplier who was a weak link. And again, what we've done at Exiger is look at the cyber exposure on a multi-tier basis of corporates. And let's face it, without the information flow, your supply chains do not flow at all. It's all very well to look at the product flow, but if you don't have the information with it, very basic example, if you don't know, if your computer system in the warehouse doesn't operate correctly, I'm afraid either the people or the robots do not know where to pick those goods and get them out to the end consumer. So cyber is another area that companies, I hope, are increasingly aware of, but they need to think of it in a supply chain context as well.
So Nick and Kim, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on some of the topics you've talked about, what would be the best place for them to go? And Kim, if I could perhaps start with you.
I think a great source would be the Exiger website. We've got all the sort of key links, as we mentioned, around the trade framework and our Supply Chain Explorer. And of course, we've also got contact details on our website where you can just reach out to either myself or even Nick, directly to really ask some specific questions.
So we're going to link to that resource in the show notes. And I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to visit with me today. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. This is Tom Fox again. Hope you will join me tomorrow where we take a look at supply chain issues in IT and communication sector. You can join the fight to secure our global supply chain by obtaining early access trial licenses to Exiger Supply Chain Explorer by visiting exiger.com, and we've linked to the site on the show notes. You can also find out how Exiger is making the world a safer and more effective place to do business by following Exiger on LinkedIn or reaching out to any of the experts featured on today's podcast. This special 5-part series has been a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.